Good evening and welcome. Welcome to Harvard. Welcome to the Kennedy School of Government. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Joe McCarthy. I'm Senior Associate Dean and Director of Degree Programs here at the Kennedy School. And it's an honor and a privilege for me to say a few words of greeting and introduction to this, the 12th, and it shows how old I'm getting, the 12th annual Latino Law and Policy Conference, which is organized and run successfully every year by our wonderful students, Latino students from both the Kennedy School of Government and the Harvard Law School. When I was a boy growing up in Washington, D.C., we were all then in the spell of a dashing young U.S. president with a dazzling wife who had the ability to inspire our country and the world with his visions and his oratory. That young president took a particular interest in the future and welfare of the Americas, which was expressed in a program called the Alliance for Progress. In establishing the alliance, President Kennedy said, "We propose to complete the revolution of the Americas, to build a hemisphere where all men can hope for a suitable standard of living and all can live out their lives in dignity and in freedom. To achieve this goal, political freedom must accompany material progress. Let us once again transform the American continent into a vast crucible of revolutionary ideas and efforts, a tribute to the power of the creative energies of free men and women, an example to all the world that liberty and progress can walk hand in hand. Let us once again awaken our American revolution until it guides the struggles of people everywhere, not with an imperialism of force or fear, but the rule of courage and freedom and hope for the future of man." For me and many, the OAS has always been a reminder of both President Kennedy and the special relationship among the American states. I would think of it, and think of it still whenever I pass the beautiful OAS building on the corner of 17th Street and Constitution Avenue, just down the street from the White House. This feeling was vivid again, as was a certain sense of déjà vu last week with President Obama's attendance at the Summit of the Americas, which seemed to signal, at least in my view, and I think of others, signal a new era of hope and cooperation across our hemisphere. And it is in that context that we host this evening's forum and the president of the Organization of American States. And to introduce him, I call upon the student co-chair of Harvard's Latino Law and Policy Conference this year, Ms. Vanessa Calderon.
Welcome. Bienvenidos. My name is Vanessa Yasmin Calderon. I'm a dual degree student here at the Harvard Kennedy School and a medical student at the UCLA School of Medicine in sunny California. This year, I've had the opportunity to chair Harvard's Latino Law and Policy Conference, along with my co-chairs, Cristina Sanchez and Ruben Rodriguez, who are here in the front row. And on behalf of the Latino Conference Planning Committee, I'd like to welcome you all here to one of the Kennedy School's oldest Latino traditions, the 12th Annual Latino Law and Policy Conference. This year's theme, Building Bridges, Connecting the U.S. and Latin America, focuses on the reality and importance of interdependence between the U.S. and the Americas. According to the Census Bureau, Latinos are the fastest growing racial demographic of the United States. In 2000, Hispanics comprised approximately 12.5% of the U.S. population, and the Census Bureau estimates that proportion will double by 2050, when 102 million Hispanics are projected to reside in the United States, making up nearly 24.5% of the U.S. population. No doubt, American society is dramatically shaped by Latinos, and these trends are only going to gain momentum. Speaking of momentum, as evidence, the classic slogan of the Cesar Chavez farm workers movement, "Sí se puede," became the winning motto of Barack Obama's presidential campaign. That was no accident, as some of our panelists will describe to all of you on Saturday. This conference is motivated by the idea that it is time to merge domestic and foreign discussion of Latin America. In fact, speaking last May in Miami, President Barack Obama himself said, "It is time for us to recognize that the future security and prosperity of the United States is fundamentally tied to the future of the Americas." I hope you will be able to join us throughout the day tomorrow and Saturday morning as we address key issues facing not only the growing population of Latinos here in the United States, but issues facing Latin America and the U.S. as a whole. Now it is with great honor that I introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, the Honorable José Miguel Insulza, the current Secretary General of the Organization of American States. The OAS is the region's principal multilateral forum for strengthening democracy, promoting human rights, and confronting shared problems such as poverty, terrorism, illegal drugs, and corruption. It plays a leading role in carrying out mandates established by the Hemisphere's leaders through the Summit of the Americas, the most recent of which was held last week in Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, the summit itself is the topic of one of our panels tomorrow afternoon, when we'll hear from one of our Secretary Insulza's colleagues, Hector Morales, the U.S. Ambassador to the OAS. But today, we have Secretary General Insulza himself, a man whose life story and record of accomplishments provides inspirations for all of us here at HKS, who aspire to careers in public service. A lawyer by profession, Insulza received his law degree from the University of Chile. He then went on to receive a master's in political science at the University of Michigan. Insulza pursued a career as an academician until 1973, when the coup that brought Pinochet into power caused him to go into exile for 15 years. In 1988, after Chileans voted Pinochet out of power, Insulza returned to his home country and helped to lead a political movement toward democratic elections in 1990. Since then, Insulza has held a number of high-level government posts. Most recently, in 1999, he became Ministry Secretary General of the Presidency, and the following year, he served as Minister of the Interior and Vice President of the Republic for President Lagos. When he left that post in May 2005, he had served as the government minister for more than a decade, the longest continuous tenure for a minister in Chilean history. As we consider the theme of our conference this year, building bridges, connecting the U.S. and Latin America, it is truly a privilege to have Secretary General Insulza here to provide his perspective and expertise. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Secretary General José Miguel Insulza.
Thank you very much, and it's really an honor to be here. And I hope you will forgive me for my voice is not functioning very well today, but I hope it will get me to the end of this conference. I think that I should say, even though I'm going to be speaking mainly about Latin America and the Summit of the Americas, I should say a few words about the main theme of the conference, who's organizing the conference, the Latino students, and the role the Latino community is playing in the U.S. Since you mentioned something from where you are growing up in Washington, D.C., I'll mention something where a few years before that, when I was growing up in Santiago, Chile, I went to a boarding school of some British ladies. And then I joined the largest school, which was an American school. I was about 4th grade. But about 2 weeks after this new life had begun, we went to see the British ladies, me, my brother, and another friend. And one of the ladies asks my brother, "What's the name of your teacher?" And I felt bad at that moment when my brother said, "It's Miss Morgan." And then he goes to my friend and he said, "And what's the name of your teacher?" And he said, "Miss Nash." And I was really feeling, I was frightened because then it was me. And the name of my teacher was Miss Gonzalez. Of course, she was the only American in the three, by the way. She was the daughter of an American and a Mexican. But at those times it was very rare for, even in this country, except in the South, to find too many Latinos. When I came to the US for the first time, except in Chicago probably, in the north of the country you find very little people who speak Spanish. In Washington, D.C., you could find only basically people from the embassies. Today in Washington, D.C., you phone some service, and they'll say immediately, "For English, press 1, para español, oprima 2. And that is because this is the fourth Latino country of the world. Probably the third. I won't go into a discussion with my Spanish friends. Spain has about 44 million Latinos, if you can call them Spanish, or immigrants. Colombia has about 38 million. The Latino population in the US, counting those who still don't count, should be already over 44 million. And that's something really important, because this is and what you just said, it's going to be double, or you said double in 2050. That's a large responsibility. Being a Latino is part of the culture of this country. There is something called the American Latino, which is not a Latin American coming from somewhere else. It's somebody with his own personality. I was just telling Dean the other day, I met the new leader of the Hispanic caucus in the Congress, Ms. Nidia Hernandez, a congresswoman from New York. And then we started talking to a couple of friends, and where is she from? And I said, I think she's Mexican. She's actually Puerto Rican. So you can't really tell very much where they come from, but they're almost stronger and more united, and they're destined to play a very large role in politics, in science, in culture, in education, in art, and everywhere, also America. So I think that this is a very important development of our time, and it will probably serve very much to establish links between Latin America and the US, which are not always as strong as many people think. Last thing I'm going to say before I go into my conference. The other day, President Chavez gave a book to President Obama. And in CNN, you could read in that line down in CNN where it says, "Obscure book becomes famous thanks to Chavez giving it to Obama." The Obscure book is a classic bestseller of Latin America. Las Venas Abiertas de América Latina is one of the most read books in the books that have been read from like as a social and historic study of Latin America. Is a classic of Latin America. In this country, somebody visited Amazon just to see how many times it had been bought. Of course, it had been bought about 50 times over the past 4 or 5 years, and about 2,000 times after President Chavez gave it to President Obama. So we have a lot to work at that, and I commend you very much for doing this conference, and precisely for selecting a theme, because the relations between Latinos and Latin Americans are not always as close as they should be. Well, I should say a few words about Latin America and how Latin America is doing today. I will do it around the conference of the Americas, this 5th Summit of the Americas, just held in Trinidad and Tobago a few days ago. It ended on Sunday. But it's also true that if you are going to talk about the summit, you have to talk about the environment, what's around at this summit. And I would say that this summit was surrounded by several attitudes that did not necessarily point to an easy summit. There were some things that are in the air that probably were not easy to face. when 34 presidents sat in the same table, for the first time in the history of the Americas, 34 elected leaders. All these persons had been elected by their people to lead their countries. We got as far as 33 in the past conferences in Mar del Plata. There was a provisional government in Haiti. Now all 34 were product of elections. And there was first this sensation that a lot of people have that the U.S. has neglected Latin America very much for the past years. I mean, haven't been concerned that much. It's not that there haven't been any policies. There have been some policies, some better than others. I will refer to that a little bit later. But there was a sensation that actually the priorities of the U.S. were in some other places, were elsewhere. And that's a way of looking at it from the point of view of the United States and the people who are linked basically to the U.S. Latin America has been left aside. From the point of view of Latin Americans, I would say that the feelings are mixed in this sense. Because in the past 7 years, I mean, there's the sensation that in this first decade of the third millennium, Latin America has done reasonably well, or quite well. Of course, the first question, when you ask you've done better or worse or good or bad, the first question should always be compared to what? Compared to Latin America in the previous 2 decades. Latin America was the region in the world that grew less in the decade of the 80s and the 90s. There was no other region, developed or underdeveloped, that grew at a lower pace than Latin America, 1.3 in the 80s, 2.2 in the 90s. And that is a very low degree. That is even a low rate of growth for a developed region, which usually grows lower, of course. And that's why, by the way, just as a comment, I mean, this for example, does not apply to my country. In Chile, we grew at much faster pace in those years. But most of the countries grew very, very slowly. And that's why when you hear talk about the Washington consensus and neoliberalism and all those things that's so ideological, for a lot of people it's not that ideological. It's the fact that they did very bad in those years. They were bad years for the region. And from an economic point of view, from a strictly, and poverty was, there was more poverty in Latin America in 2000 than in 1980, percentage-wise, of course. There were more, the percent of poor people in Latin America was larger in 2000 than it was in 1980. So if you look at it compared to this, and you say, well, in the past, from 2002 to 2008, Latin America grew at a pace around 4.55% a year, with every country growing. And the rate of poverty was 44% in 2002, probably too high. It was a very bad year. It just had declined to about 35% in 2008. But that's not bad. Of course, compared it with India, with China, you'll probably say it's not good. But certainly compared to Latin America in the 90s and the 80s, it was a good growth, with a decline in poverty, which is still very high. If you consider that at the same time, we had this democratic development with all the problems that exist. I understand that with all the problems that exist, a lot of people say, well, I have this problem in this country, in another country. Yeah. But if you compare it with our history, it's the first time we have democratic governments all over the region. We're the second. The Americas are the other democratic region in the world, together with Europe. So those were good developments. And given the fact that those developments were produced in a moment in which the U.S. was not looking that much, I remember a book by Robert Pakenham, written in the 60s, who said that this was before the Alliance for Progress, by the way, I just started the Alliance for Progress. He argued that when the problems for Latin America began when the U.S. was too concerned about Latin America. One could even make a case for that. One could even make a case for that. Because there were good years, and at the same time, the U.S. was not that concerned with Latin America. So the presidents that arrived in Chile, but then something in the past 2 years, something different started to happen, because we still grew. We still grew, but it was a little bit lower. And the food crisis appeared. The prices of food went up, up, up. The oil crisis appeared, a blessing for some countries, a blessing for Venezuela, a blessing for Mexico, a blessing for Ecuador, a blessing for a couple more, a curse for others, for all the Caribbean, of course, for all Central America, for my own country, a very bad development. So the oil crisis also slapped a lot of Latin American countries. And at the same time, and growth was not as much as it should be. So we were a little bit restless until the advent of a new economic crisis was recognized by the end of last year. At the beginning, Latin Americans said that they were better prepared, and probably they are better prepared. There are some countries that have a lot of good developments. They can do well, but it's not necessary. It's not. I mean, it was our growth of the past our 5% of the past years, and of the countries that did best, is an export-led growth. So if the world economy falls, certainly those products are not sold at the prices and in the volumes in which they were sold in last years, so we get hit by the crisis anyway. And some people say this is from the north. No, yes, in the north it was worse. In Mexico, in Central America, it struck almost immediately. It took a little bit longer to fall to Brazil, to Argentina, to Colombia, but it's getting there eventually. So the climate for the Conference of the Americas was not a very good one. In a normal situation, you would have expected to meet with some presidents who are going to say, this time we didn't do it. It is not our crisis. We didn't create this crisis. You brought this crisis upon us, so what are you going to do with it? So the climate was not as hopeful for the conference as we could expect. And at the same time, we also have to add to that some other things have happened in the hemisphere. They have the divisions. The sub-regional organizations have strengthened. There are some countries who have very different policies. There are some countries in which the U.S. is directly criticized by some of the presidents. That happened even during the conference. So from that point of view, you will also expect kind of a restless atmosphere. And in spite of this, the conference went very well. It was an excellent conference. And of course, the change of the new president of the United States had a lot to do with that. One must have just to admit that. I think that if you look at, I said this about 3 weeks before the conference, by the way, in a meeting such as this in Washington. They asked me, what do you expect? I mean, what are the basic factors for a successful conference? I said, first, that there's a willingness to face the crisis, like a new message to face the crisis. Second, that we're able to draft an agenda, a common agenda. But third, the attitude of the new president of the United States is basic. Actually, I think that the president, if I could summarize it, it was only one sentence. I would quote a sentence from President Obama from about a month ago, not now, when he said, I want to make policy with you and not for you. And a lot of presidents went there to see if this could happen. And I would say that in general, they came out convinced that it might happen. I'm not going to say that they were that everything went well, because if you have a conference 3 months after the inauguration, The good thing is that everybody gets to meet you immediately. The bad thing is that you can't say, I have a policy to offer. I have a proposal to offer. So I would say the conference was a very good beginning. A very good beginning. The hope for a new relationship, for a new hemispheric relationship. And the President Obama was very important, who, by the way, was playing in his home field, because actually in the Caribbean he's much more popular than any other leader in the world. In Trinidad and Tobago, President Obama was properly at home. So that was also a very important thing. People sometimes tend to forget the existence of that part of Latin America. I've grown used to, as a Secretary General of the OAS, to say Latin America and the Caribbean. Usually Latin American presidents don't say that. They say Latin America, and they think that everybody is included. This is new reality, this reality of a growing Caribbean region, which is very much, of course, and even more enthusiastic about the president, the new president of the United States, than the rest of Latin America. So he was very much also in a favorable terrain. So why am I saying that this is a new beginning? First, because there was a new way of listening and of talking, and this was believed. But then, so there was all this bad environment turned the conference, turned into what I would call a goodwill conference, a goodwill meeting. If the term had not been used before, I would call this the Goodwill Summit. But it was used before, and I want to refer to that just it's part of history. You remember that President Ronald Reagan never met a Soviet leader during his first 4 years in office. Because he had begun with the axis of evil, it wasn't the axis of evil, but it was evil, and the evil empire, and he never met a Soviet leader. So finally, the first year of his second mandate, he met with Prime Minister Kosygin, Alexei Kosygin, or Andrei Kosygin. And of course, there wasn't much of an agenda. They didn't have much to agree on. So somebody used this word, a goodwill summit. This was a goodwill summit. And former President Richard Nixon wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs saying, it was a goodwill summit, it's a good thing, but goodwill tends to turn into bad will if after a reasonable period of time, common interests are not at the center of problem, if we don't find our common interests and our common policies. So this summit is a goodwill summit. This summit is a beginning, but then we have to see if we can deal with the agenda. Because we have an agenda. If you read all these documents that usually appear during the... Can I have a glass of water, please? Thank you. Those documents that are usually prepared by think tanks for the US president, what you have to do with Latin America, what are you going to do with Europe, what are you going to do with Asia, etc. And you look at all the conferences that took place before the summit, they all speak about the same things. And they are very relevant themes for the region and for the US. This is the first time we have an agenda. The second, you mentioned the Alliance for Progress. That was the first time in which the interests of Latin America and the US coincided. Before it was security on one side and development on the other, many times. But this time we have an agenda, and I will just go over the few issues of that. First, of course, because this has to do, of course, with the problems of the region, but those problems are hemispheric in nature. It's not the problem of one country or another country. They are problems that have to do with the whole of the hemisphere. One is, the first one, which is the karma of Latin America, is that we are Fernando Enrique Cardoso, the past president of Brazil, once said of his country, "This is not a poor country," he said. "It's an unfair country." And the same thing can be said about Latin America. Latin America is not a poor continent. Compared to Asia, or to some parts of Asia, or to Africa, it certainly is much richer than those. So there's no reason why we should have 35% poor, even if it's better than 44 that we had 7 years ago. Poverty, inequality, problems of jobs are, I would say, the largest problem of Latin America. We're not able to tackle that together. Difficulties will continue to arise. And many of the problems that we have hemispherically, such as migration, will continue to grow. So that's the first issue, and that was recognized by every member in the region. We do have a program for that, and it is interesting. It's a sign of the new times, something we call the Network for Social Development of the Americas. That was agreed by our ministers in Reñaca, Chile, about a year ago. It's being inaugurated next month in New York. Why in New York? Because the mayor of New York decided to apply the Mexican program of oportunidades, to the poorest sectors around New York City, which is a good sign. I mean, we are really beginning to exchange experiences, and there are programs like Oportunidades, now called Vivir Mejor, like Bolsa Familia in Brazil, like the Solidaridad in Chile, or Solidaridad, or the Programa Puente in Chile, like I don't remember the name of the program in Colombia. There are programs that are working to alleviate poverty. We have to strengthen that. That's the first point in our agenda. The second point, of course, has to do with energy. After all, present at this meeting were 3 of the largest providers of oil to this country, which are Mexico, Canada, and Venezuela, who, I should say something about Venezuela as a country, as you know, which is, people say that a lot of people say that the U.S. has a very bad relation with Venezuela, and Venezuela sells about 1 million barrels of oil a day to the U.S. And of course, it's not true. They sell about 1 million barrels, or a little less, I don't know how many gallons, of gasoline to U.S. consumers coming out of pumps of Citgo, which is a Venezuelan company. I mean, the oil industry is probably one example of one of the best vertical integrations that we know of in the Americas, and there is no rhetoric that has to change that. Some similar things happen with Mexico, of course with Canada, where oil also comes through pumps to this country. So that's a hemispheric matter we have to talk about. If you think that ethanol, alternative energies, hydroelectric energy, geothermic energy, and all that are spread all over the Americas, so we can have, as President Obama has proposed, a partnership for energy. But that has to be studied very carefully, because the interests of different countries are countries have very different interests in this. And those who have gas don't have geothermic, and those who have geothermics and eolic do not have oil, and the ones that have oil are not very happy about biofuels and all that. It has to be built very complexly, but it's also an agenda point. And then the other one is, of course, global warming. I think we can't get together in this matter of global warming. Until a few months ago, we couldn't. The U.S. didn't admit the existence of a problem of global warming. Now that's done. There is a conference in Copenhagen. We have to work in that direction. And fifth, and it goes a little bit further, but these are the points that were dealt with in the summit, is the issue of crime. I should have said among the good things of Latin America is that we are a peaceful continent. We are a continent at peace. We haven't had wars, real wars, for almost a century. But some of our countries, not all of them, have the highest rates of homicides in the world. According to the World Health Organization, a reasonable, if homicide can be reasonable, a reasonable rate of homicide is about 4 per 100,000 inhabitants. In the world, there are about 7 per 100,000. In Latin America, the rate is 22 to 23 murders for 100,000 inhabitants. And in some countries of the Caribbean and of Central America, they are about over 50, even 60 per 100,000, which is something that's not very much spoken about, not only in summits, but anywhere. The other day, I read in the papers, I was reading The Economist, and many things that you say about countries have to do with the strength with which you say them. It's not the same to say he stole me $100 to say he stole me $100. There are 8,000 homicides in Mexico last year, said The Economist. 8,000 murders in the country in a year. Well, by the way, there were two Central American countries in which there were more homicides than that in the year, and they have about 1/10 of the population of Mexico. So the problem of homicide, and Mexico is supposed to be the crisis. So you can imagine, if that's supposed to be a crisis, you can imagine what the situation is in other countries of the region in which the size of crime is much larger. And behind that, of course, and by the way, there are some countries to the south of Latin America, that have less murders, a lower rate of homicide than the US or than Canada, or even than Canada. So it's a very unequal situation, but the basic things are more or less the same. It's drug trafficking, it's organized gangs, it's money laundering, it's smuggling, human traffic, and several other things, and we have to deal with that together. And very much connected with this, of course, is the traffic of weapons. Some very, not very much mentioned subject in the conference was President Obama's promise to propose the Senate to ratify the Convention on the illegal traffic of conventional weapons. We have been waiting for that for many years. Now, if you add to that issues of trade, we still have a lot of problems with trade. Latin American countries have better buyers from the US than a lot of countries who are more important allies. Brazil buys as much as France. And of course, Chile and Argentina buy much more American products than India or Russia. So trade is still an important issue. And some agreements that are pending in Congress are still a problem. Migration, of course, is an issue that was not dealt with in the summit. And I think that we have to deal with that. But of course, we have a couple of, and I'll finish with this, a couple of big challenges before we deal with the agenda. We have to deal with this agenda. This is a common agenda. These are the things that American citizens talk as much as Brazilian citizens or Colombian citizens. But we have to deal with two other issues. One is the crisis itself. As the president of, I think it was the president of Chile, said at the beginning of the conference, this is not just a matter of the structural problems of the economy. No, we have a problem now. What are we going to do about it? The financing of the multilateral financial institutions of the region is a very important issue. The Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, the IDB, became a very important issue during the conference because all presidents asked for an increase in capital for this organization to be able to loan to countries that are not, that don't have money to carry out counter-cyclical policies. I cannot but tell you something I heard from a finance minister of another country which is not Latin American. In a conference a couple of months ago, he said, everybody, everywhere, every time I go to Congress, he said, They tell me, why don't you do what the Americans do, or what the British do? Run a deficit. You run a deficit. And he said, but nobody lends me money to run a deficit. I mean, the deficit, I don't know how much the deficit of this country is going to be, but the British deficit is about 11% of the budget. But there is somebody willing to loan the money to cover the deficit. So what's happening is that you're taking a debt, but that's a viable policy. The money is there. For many countries in the Americas, the smallest ones, the poorest ones, the money is not there. Some of them have them. Chile has large reserves. Brazil has an important reserve. Mexico has a reserve. But then those reserves it's not something you just take out and spend, because the moment you spend them, everybody says, oh, the reserves of Mexico are dwindling very much. This is a very serious situation. So reserves are supposed to be there for times of dire need. And there are no resources flowing to the region because the banks are not lending money. And that we have to solve before we start talking about the other problems, because that's what the other countries are waiting for. And the other one is Cuba, which is a way of not understanding. Some people ask me sometimes, I mean, there's a crisis going on, and there's crime going on, and there's a global warming. Why are the Latin Americans concerned about Cuba? Well, because it's become simple. I think out of a misunderstanding for many years, it has become like a symbol. You see, when the president of El Salvador is inaugurated on the 1st of June, one of the first things he's going to do is going to establish relations with Cuba, and that will make it 33. 33 countries of the hemisphere will have normal relations, will normalize relations with Cuba, including Canada, of course, who never broke them. And the U.S. doesn't have relations with Cuba. So the issue of the embargo, more than, well, I've spoken a lot about the OAS, that Cuba should be allowed to, no, I haven't even said to rejoin the OAS. What I'm saying is that we should revoke a resolution. The resolution that suspended Cuba from the OAS in 1962 doesn't speak very much about democracy. And it's not difficult to understand why it doesn't speak much about democracy. Because many countries were not democratic anyway, of the countries that were signing that resolution. So it does speak about Marxism, Leninism, and the threat that Cuba, the big threat is that Cuba is a member of the Sino-Soviet axis. Well, the Sino-Soviet axis doesn't exist. The Soviet part disappeared a long time ago, and the Chinese part is the first trade partner of the United States. So all I'm saying is that we should do away with that and then talk to Cuba about democracy and other issues and all that. But in fact, the big problem is not if Cuba joins or not, doesn't join the institutions, even though I speak a lot about that. It's the problem of the embargo. And I think that a matter pending from the summit was the absence of Cuba, which after all everybody agreed to leave aside for a moment and say, okay, we understand, it's only 3 months away. Okay, but we would hope Cuba to be here. But I think that in truth that if the problem is not solved, it will be very difficult to have a successful summit of the Americas. That's the one we have just had. I will stop here so that we can exchange some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. You've helped us with a very good start in the conference's objective of building bridges. And now, as is the custom in the Kennedy Forum, we will take questions from the audience. As several of the members of the audience have already indicated, we ask these questions at the microphones. There are 2 on the floor and 2 in the middle loges. So please approach a microphone. This isn't just so that you can be heard here, but all of our forums are webcast, and it records the question and then the answer, and is being broadcast over the World Wide Web. So if you would approach the microphones. And as is also our custom, begin the question, if you will, by identifying yourself and your affiliation with the Kennedy School or Harvard, if any, and please keep the question brief so others can join in as well. Thank you. We'll start over here, and we'll then go clockwise around the forum.
First, thank you very much for coming to speak with us. My name is David Bluestone. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School and also a member of the Conference Planning Committee. My question is regarding the U.S.'s role in Latin America as compared to the emerging role of China and the European Union. And I was hoping that you could comment about the relative power that these larger nations are having right now in the region, and the prospects that you see for perhaps the U.S. regaining a larger role, or whether from here on out the status quo is going to be more balanced between these superpowers. Thank you.
It's hard to make, I mean, we have to make a distinction in this case. Actually, the countries to the south, in South America, especially the southernmost, I mean, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, have always had very balanced relations with the U.S. and with other regions in economic terms. Actually, I think that the total volume of exports of Brazil to the U.S. is less than what they export to Europe, what they trade with Europe. And that's the general view. In the past few years, there has been a great increase of the presence of China everywhere. But it's a different presence. If you look at it from Mexico, China is seen as a competitor, because Mexico competes with China in the U.S. market. For Argentina or Brazil, China is a buyer. So that's a much more positive view, of course. Huh? The presence of China, the presence of China is really not the presence of Asia. I remember when I was foreign minister of Chile in the 90s, there was we had more trade with Asia in general than with the U.S. But it was more to Japan. Japan was about 50%. China was number 4. Now China is by larger, I mean by the largest. There is a lot of investment. It was funny because when China started getting into South America, they came with the old proposal of this trade, long-term trade. They issued you a price and you issued a quantity and the others, and they were saying, no, we are oriented by the market. I mean, you want to buy. The market will solve everything. Now, Latin America, some South Americans are returning to those long-term contracts and things like that. So the presence of China is quite established in that region. But as I said, in the south, more as a buyer. And of course, they sell a lot also, but especially buyers of copper, buyers of soybeans, buyers of minerals, etc. As investors, especially in mining, but also in other parts. While in the northern part, especially in Mexico, they are seen more as competitors, actually. And Europe is more stable. Europe, I mean, is as much a competitor with the, I mean, it's as much a presence today. And not one thing, as much a presence, economic presence today as it was 20 years ago. I mean, of course, Latin America has become much more open. Now, in political terms, the Chinese have never been back. I mean, have never been involved again in Latin America since those years, since the Mao Zedong years, in which they promoted some very radical movements. After all, Sendero Luminoso, as you know, Shining Path is an inheritance of those years. So they are not politically active. While the other ones, as you know, I mean, the Europeans have a long-standing political presence in Latin America with even sister parties in many parts of the region, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats and all that. So I think but in fact, I will say that you can derive any kind of threat for Latin America, for the U.S. interest in Latin America from the presence of other powers. One could say that there would be an exception in this offers by some countries, or some country, of receiving Russian bombers and things like that, but that's still very much in the realm of posturing and more than in the realm of real activity. Yes.
Right here.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Buenas tardes, señor secretario, y bienvenido. My name is Jesus Manuel Acuña. I'm from Mexico, and I'm also in the program of public policy, and I'm a member of the Latino caucus. Even though you touched the topic about Cuba, and it has been the topic of it has been one of the main topics in the news regarding the summit. My question is the following: what is the role that the organization will actively take, if it's going to take any kind of role, to pressure, quote unquote, the United States to lift the embargo?
Well, actually, no. The problem is that we can make statements if you want, but you see, a few people know that the suspension of Cuba in the 60s was accompanied by economic sanctions. In 1975, in San Jose, Costa Rica, in the General Assembly of San Jose, Costa Rica, the OAS as such lifted all sanctions to Cuba. The only country that remains with sanctions, with economic sanctions to Cuba, is the US. So my first answer would be, it's a bilateral matter. I mean, even if we don't like it, it's the US that has an embargo on Cuba. But I think some of the countries are exercising pressure, and we might raise the issue again, because you see the Helms-Burton law creates a very ungrateful choice for Latin American companies. You either do business with Cuba or you do business with the US. You can't do both. And that certainly is a form of, I would say, intervention. The matter was not raised. It wasn't raised in the summit, but it's still there. It was heatedly discussed in the General Assembly of '96 in Panama. I was foreign minister of Chile at that time, so I remember that very well. But it has, when the Helms-Burton law, the Helms-Burton law was going to be approved by the U.S. Congress, it has not been discussed again. I assume that it will come up in the next discussion in the U.S. This damage created to some Latin American economies is going to reappear, yes. And then we will have to take some action on that.
And then,
No, sorry, there's another one there.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary General. First of all, thank you for being here. I want to say that it's an honor for us as Chileans to have a countryman leading the Organization of American States so successfully. My question is twofold. First is, how do you see or foresee the future of Latin America in the next 20 years? Do you think there's any chance that Latin America will follow the path of Europe in the last 2 decades in terms of integration of their political institution, of their financial system, of their currency, of eliminating the border, the customs between the countries? And secondly, what will be the role of the organization be in that case?
Well, there's two parts of the question. One is, I think that Latin American countries in many cases have gone through some severe problems of inconsistencies and lack of consensus in matters of economic and social policies. go from one policy to the other one. And if you want to know which are going to be successful in the next 20 years, are probably the ones that are more consistent on the path that they're following in terms of economic development. I think that in that sense we have a problem. If you look at the famous Millennium Goals, for example, some countries of Latin America are going to reach the goals. They are the most developed ones. The ones that are not going to reach the goals are the ones that have lagged more behind. So the gap between some Latin Americans and others is growing very large, and this is a problem. Some countries, and I can mention them because they were mentioned in the conference and they are well known, in some countries are really very poor countries. Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guyana, Bolivia, are very poor countries that are certainly lagging behind in development, and something must be done. If they are going to be successful in the next 20 years, everybody would have to join forces to help them improve. Because they are lagging behind. Countries such as Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Cuba are going to surpass the Millennium Goals without any problems in 2015. So that's a big problem. The other problem is integration. I think in reality, Latin American integration has many problems before facing the ones that you mentioned. The first problem is, which is, I would say, fairly overcome now, was this obsession with continental integration. One Latin America from the Rio Grande to the Tierra del Fuego and all that, that's completely impossible. It didn't start like that in Europe. It hasn't moved that very far in Latin America. I very much believe in sub-regional integrations. I think the Central American integration is going well. I think that for a time the Mercosur was doing well also. The CARICOM, of course, it's an example, even though they're having a lot of problems now with their single economy. But in spite of everything, we still have to decide if we want to have real economic integration or we're going to stick to continue sticking to some taboos which we cannot change. I mean, like full sovereignty, for example. You know, your country and mine, which is the same, signed the free trade agreement, and Mexico also did sign the free trade agreement with Europe. The trade part of that agreement was ratified only by the European Parliament. The countries have given up their sovereignty in those matters. There's only one trade area, and who negotiates trade for the whole of Europe is the European Union. We don't have those supranational, and the Mercosur doesn't have a supranational institution. The SICA in Central America doesn't have it, the Andean community either. They have bureaucracies, but not supranational decision making. We don't have compensation systems. We don't have compensation systems. Latin Americans, I mean, especially agricultural countries in Latin America, don't like the common agricultural policy of the European Union, the CAP. But the CAP was the tool by which Germany and the richer countries of Europe financed the poorest so that the integration could take place. And if we don't finance, I mean, if the richer countries of South America or Latin America are not willing to finance the poorest ones so that integration, so that they can buy your products, you're not going to get any place. I mean, if you don't have unbalanced agreements in favor of the poorest countries so that they can really find some interest, because what interest could there be in a country with a weak industry to have free trade agreements with a country with a large, big industry? Well, develop other sectors, then develop the agriculture of those countries, develop the infrastructure of those countries, and for that you have to compensate. We don't have compensation mechanisms. We don't have systems of conflict resolution which are valid, and so I mean, we're still, and we don't have full integration in tariffs either. So actually, I think that Latin Americans usually, I think President Ricardo Lagos said that once. He said when a person is competing in a jumping meeting, he first has the bar at 1 meter, 1.8 meter, and before putting it at 2 meters, you have to jump the 180. I mean, then you raise it. Latin America usually raise it without jumping the first one. We want to have a common parliament and a common currency without having the common market, without having a system of problem solution, without having compensation, without having a supranationality. So I must admit that I am very critical I am very much in favor, but I am very critical of the real progresses of Latin American integration.
And now finally, we'll get this lady.
Thank you very much. We have more.
Thank you for joining us. My name is Wavina Belmonte. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. Quite rightly, you spoke of the great advances economically and politically in the region. You also alluded to the disparities in the region. Dr. Mirta Rosas, the director of PAHO, has coined the term the tyranny of averages in Latin America and Caribbean, talking not only about the region, but about within certain countries where health rates are equal to Timor-Leste or Bangladesh in certain countries. I'm just wondering, since you alluded to the Millennium Development Goals, whether you think there's value for countries in the region to make the goals even more challenging in the countries that are well off, but that still have those vast disparities in pockets of the countries.
Well, yes, I agree that we have very different countries. I mean, we have a variety of countries, and wealth and size and everything is enormous in Latin America, so the averages are also always a tragedy. There's a Caribbean country which ranks number 4 or 5, number 5 in deaths, in homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. But then it had 14 homicides last year. The problem is that that country is so small that 14 homicides amounts for about 36 in 100,000 inhabitants, which is much higher than most of the other countries of the region. I agree with you that and I think that several countries are in a position to make the goals more demanding. There's no reason why countries that have surpassed already $10,000 per capita income in real terms, I mean PPP, can stick to can say that they're going to have a big success because they meet the Millennium Goals in 2015. They should surpass largely the Millennium Goals, and that's true especially in health. I know Mirta is working very hard to try to convince some countries of reaching something that we would call the Millennium Plus goals and go further than the present ones.
Go back over here.
Buenas tardes. My name is Carlos Bortoni. I'm from Mexico and I study at the college. My question is in the area of inter-American security and specifically drug trade and arms trafficking. So how do you see the OAS with its Commission on Anti-Terrorism and other offices trying to coordinate efforts against drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, and also like terrorism? What's the OAS role in this field?
Well, actually, the CICAD, the Commission on Drug Traffic and Drug Commission, is very strong in two of the three issues having to do with drugs, which are prevention and attention of victims of drug trafficking. But I think that we should we have a much stronger policy also in matters of interdiction. I mean, we do a lot of work in education and all these things. We do a lot of work with victims. We train a lot of people for security in ports and other matters, but we have not been, I must admit that we have not largely been involved in the repressive part of the question. Probably we're having a meeting next week to discuss this matter. The reason is very simple, is that some of the services are very jealous of their own attention on this. I mean, there's a lot of proposals for cooperation, but in fact, in matters of interdiction, most services are very jealous of what they are doing, and they trust very little the other ones. So We've had, when I was Minister of the Interior, we had some very good cooperation in Chile with the Brazilian, the Peruvian, the Argentinian services, and we did some very good things. I mean, usually, I mean, you have a lot of these blockings at the borders, but let me tell you one thing for experience, you almost never find drugs in a border post by surprise. You find them because you confiscate them because you know they're coming. You already learned that they were coming. Intelligence is probably the best way for interdiction. And we practice very little intelligence, common intelligence. We don't share enough as much as we should do. And I think that's a big problem. There's a big discussion today here in this country, even though it's more not very open, on the problems of the drug policy. There's a lot of sensation that things have not gone well, that demand continues to be stable, not rising, but stable, and that unless we reduce demand, we're not going to make it. The other day, none other but former president of Colombia, Cesar Gaviria, said at an open conferences in the Brookings Institution, the Plan Colombia has been a big success for Colombia. We have reduced violence, we have sent a lot of drug traffickers to jail, the country is more peaceful, etc. But the drugs continue to flow. And they will continue to flow until you find ways of reducing demand.
Thank you.
It's up here now.
Thank you very much for speaking to us today. My name is Francisco. I'm a first-year student of public policy here at the Kennedy School. And I have a very specific question to ask you about the Bolivia-U.S. relations. For the past few years, Bolivia has claimed that the U.S. government was involved with opposition movements and opposition parties within Bolivia. We know that Evo Morales was elected democratically. The OAS oversaw the elections. My question is, what is the stand of the OAS regarding these claims by the Bolivian government? And the second part of the question would be, if Bolivia were to provide conclusive evidence of the involvement of the U.S. government in internal Bolivian politics, what could the OAS do about it? Yes, that's the question.
Well, I'm going to say something about the first part, and that will explain the cautious of my answer to the second. Of a comment, I will answer the second one. We are very involved in Bolivia. I think I was together with the, excuse me, this is my phone that is ringing, it shouldn't be ringing, but I was together with the foreign minister of Venezuela, the only two foreigners present at the signature of the Bolivian Constitution. We work strongly to have, we have observed all the elections, we have supported everything they want to do, and we will continue doing that. I mean, the President Morales announced a hunger strike last week, and finally he announced that he was going to have a new electoral register on Friday, on Thursday, past Thursday, and the OAS people were in Bolivia on Monday to begin working on the register. And we want to keep that as close and as safe as possible. I think that Bolivia is a country that must be helped. Bolivia is it's a very poor country, the poorest country in South America, and also one of the most unequal, even though many people don't believe that. Social injustice is very strong also in Bolivia. Just an example. You know that the less unequal country in Latin America is Uruguay. The least unequal. I don't remember exactly the ratio, but the ratio is quite satisfactory even for there are poor, but there are not as many, and the rich are not as rich as in other places. And in spite, but at the same time, it's much wealthier than Bolivia, of course. Being much, with those two things said, the 20%, the poorest 20% of Uruguayans take home 8% of the GNP. The poorest 20% of Bolivians take home 2.4% of the GNP, which is much lower a GMP that is much lower than the one in Uruguay. So it's really, and I used to say another thing, I mean, Bolivia has always been damaged in its relations with foreigners. Potosí was the first, you know that in the 17th century, Potosí was the largest city in South America because silver was lying in the ground. You should go to Potosí now. And after the silver, it was the tin, and after the tin, it was something else. And now, I mean, of course, they are very suspicious of foreign intervention. And I do hope that it is very, very, very difficult to dispel that from one day to the other. So I usually don't get involved in the problems between Bolivia and the United States. But I am certain, I must say that I am certain that if some proof were found that some people from the U.S. had tried to intervene lately in Bolivia, this U.S. government will do something about it without the need to be denounced or something like that. That's what President Obama promised, by the way, and I'm sure that we'll stand by that promise. But don't expect, because of that, relations between the U.S. with Bolivia to improve very highly in the next few years. It will take time. It will take time. Times have not been easy for that nation in the past 5 centuries. So it's only fair to say that we should wait at least for 5 or 6 years for them to improve.
Up here.
Hi, my name is Ruben Rodriguez. I'm a 1L at the law school. I'm also one of the conference organizers. Returning to Cuba for a moment, you spoke of your desire to see the suspension of Cuba from the OAS lifted, but you also mentioned how happy you were to see 34 democratically elected heads of state at the Summit of the Americas. So my question is, what role do you see for the OAS in pushing for democratic reforms in Cuba?
Well, I think that that's a very good question, and let me say this, probably my positions are very much misunderstood. And I'm saying let me put it this way, there's an old door that has been closed for 48 years, and there's a very rusty lock put there. I mean, I want to get rid of the lock because it's old-fashioned, it's rusty, and it's damaging everything. But then you have to open the door. And to open the door, you have to talk about democracy, about human rights, about several other things. That's the way it is at the OAS for everybody. For everybody. I mean, every country in Latin America, in the Americas, is subject to the Commission on Human Rights. That's not even in the famous Inter-American Democratic Charter. It's in the Charter of the OAS that you have to be, that there is a Commission on Human Rights that passes report on every country, except one. Why not? Because it's suspended. Every country is a member of every country signed it was asked to sign and signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter in 2001, except one because nobody called them to have it signed because it was suspended. So if you want to challenge Cuba with democracy, don't have them suspended for being members of the Soviet side, of the Sino-Soviet Axis. I mean, let's face the situation. I mean, some Cuban leaders don't like what I'm saying either. They think because they don't want to come back to the OAS. It's much easier for them to stay out. I mean, but I think, I'm not in a position. I'm not the one who has to decide that. It's the member countries that have to decide that. But my view is that if you're going to do something about Cuba, first get rid of that crazy thing, that piece of Cold War that's lagged behind in some corner. That's the whole thing.
We'll take 2 more questions.
Lady
First one here.
Thank you. My name is Carolina Roca. I'm from Guatemala and an alumni of the Kennedy School, and this year a fellow at the Weatherhill Center for International Affairs. My question is related to the effects that the crisis is posing on the willingness to advance the pro-free trade policies in America in general, because we have seen growing pressures for protectionism in developed countries and anti-free trade policies, attitudes in developing countries. So what's your opinion on the effects?
Well, a few months ago, before the crisis started, or about this, before the crisis was felt, I received a letter from the Brazilian and the US coordinators of the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, who were the last, the ones that were appointed in 2005, but have remained up to now because the negotiations were not moving. And they formally asked me, after consulting with every country, to act as a keeper of all the documents of this, of the FTAA. So I think that it's very important to say that from every practical point of view, the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas is dead, or in hibernation in some vault at the Organization of American States. But it did produce a lot of results. I mean, after all, there are several countries that have free trade agreements among them and with others. My country has free trade agreements practically with every country in the Americas. So does Peru, so does Panama, so does the US. No, excuse me, the US, yes. The US has free trade agreements with Canada and Mexico, has a free trade agreement with all Central America and the Dominican Republic, has a pending agreement with Peru, an agreement with Chile, and two pending agreements with Panama and Colombia that have not been approved in Congress. Let's take that. I mean, the other ones have all kinds of things. So that leaves aside two countries who were actually in negotiations, but that was suspended because they are still, I mean, in both countries they felt, and in the US also, that the two countries were not in conditions of facing a free trade agreement, which were Ecuador and Bolivia. So they have something which is called the ATP-DEA, which is a treaty, an agreement by which they receive unilateral preferences. In the case of Bolivia, they are suspended because of the problem of the spelling of the ambassador and all that. But I am certain that Congress will reinstate them very soon. And that is a good arrangement. So who leaves that? Who's there? And then there's the Mercosur, the four Mercosur countries and Venezuela. Venezuela is against the FTAA. President Chavez was very strongly saying in Trinidad that fortunately we had left behind the FTA. The truth is that if there's one country that has absolutely no need of a free trade agreement with the US, that's Venezuela. I mean, they sell all the oil that the US can buy. And that's about everything they sell So when other countries such as Colombia or Panama are trying to sell their goods, because, I mean, you negotiate free trade agreements to sell your stuff to somebody else. Now, if you sell everything, what's the point in having a free trade agreement? And by the way, because of the mechanism I explained, the Venezuelan oil is even free of tariff, even if they rose protectionist tariffs. No. The oil comes into the Venezuelan refineries in the Gulf. There are 8, and then goes to from 12,000 to 13,000 pumps. I mean, gas stations across the country. So Venezuela has a free trade agreement with the U.S. And it has grown in the past years, not because of the prices, but also in terms of volume, at a time at least. So that leaves the real problem. The real problem is the Mercosur, especially the big agricultural and industrial countries of Brazil and Argentina. And those countries are not willing to negotiate anything until the problems of agricultural protectionism and of intellectual property are solved at the World Trade Organization. That was what produced the failure. And of course, Uruguay would probably be a little bit more flexible, but they're the same thing, and Paraguay follows suit. So that's the end of a period in free trade in the Americas, except for the possibility of the U.S., for 3 possibilities. 1, the approval of the 2 treaties that are pending. 2, the agreement, the possibility of an agreement with, well, there's an agreement going to sign with Uruguay also, whether it's of a smaller nature, but it's there. Then two is the possibility of an agreement with the Caribbean, with the CARICOM of the U.S. Canada is signing one, maybe the U.S. will do. And the other one is something which is called, I mean, the Latin Americans were more realistic in this, have some very clumsy name for this, I don't remember what it was, but President Bush called it the pathway to prosperity, which is like a kind of a negotiation among countries that have a lot of free trade agreements in order to try to harmonize all these agreements. In my time we call that the spaghetti bowl. It's like all these trade agreements, one dealing with the same things and all in the same bowl. So why not harmonize them? That's another possibility. But that must be done, that's why we don't like that much the pathway to prosperity. That has to be done without being menacing or damaging for the countries of the Mercosur that, as I tell you, are very adamant on the idea that until the Doha round is concluded, we will not have any more trade agreements.
Okay, this will have to be up here, our final question in the middle lunch.
Hi, how are you? My name is Martha Morales. I'm a graduate student at Brandeis at the Heller School. And I want to ask you about the big topic of inequalities. I believe the pie in our region is set. And if we want to share the pie, people that have more amount of it need to give up and share part of their piece of the pie. So you hung out with several leaders of our region, and I want to know, in your experience, how willing they are to share the pie, not only for resources, but also for opportunities to all the people in the region.
I think that we have to be very strong in putting before the people and the leaders the real problems. Because there's all kinds of policies for distribution and all that, but some things are never said. I think that it's very good to have this, I mentioned it before, these policies to alleviate poverty, but those will have to do with poverty. They will not have to do with inequality. Inequality, I think, has a lot to do with some old-fashioned issues, such as labor rights. Of course, it has to do with education also, let's say that. I mean, we're still very much exporters of or producers of commodities. That's a fact. And the more we improve our educational system, the better we will create good jobs. And that's a fact. I mean, I very much share, therefore, the idea that the path to development is through education. But then there's the old-fashioned things which many of our leaders don't want to talk about, and one of those has to do with labor rights, and the other one has to do with taxes. There's a study by the OECD that has a very curious conclusion. I don't know if those of you who study economics are familiar with something called the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a coefficient from 0 to 1 that measures inequality, being 0, no inequality, and I mean everybody equal, and 1, total inequality, which doesn't, I mean, none of that will exist, so they all tend to move around the middle. If you look at the Gini coefficient of Europe and the Gini coefficient of Latin America, they are not tremendously different. I'm not really sure if I'm saying exactly the numbers, but let me try to that. The Gini coefficient for Europe is 0.48, and the Gini coefficient for Latin America is 0.54, I think 0.56 or 54. From 0.54 for 48 to 0.54, there's not much difference. That's before taxes. After taxes, the inequality coefficient in Europe falls 12 points to 0.36. and the inequality coefficient in Latin America falls 2 points, from 0.56 to 0.54. So taxes don't equalize anything. Some countries are, and that has to do with partly with the lack of strength of the institutions. That, I mean, so if you don't have a very good government institution, it's easier to collect taxes via the value-added tax and direct taxes than direct taxes. It's easier. But it also has to do with a sense of inequality. It's always been that way. So there are known ways in which there are a lot of things that are not matters of magic. The tax burden in Europe is twice as much as the one in Latin America. Now, those are things that are never said in political campaigns. I mean, in political campaigns, a typical Latin American politician will promise their citizens they will live that like in Denmark, and will promise that they won't have to pay more taxes than they are paying now. Do you know how much taxes the Danes pay, by the way? 53%. Of course, they have health, they have education, they have housing, they have retiring, and all that. And I agree that, I mean, it seems to be a good bargain, but maybe they like it, maybe the Danes like it. And maybe the Latin Americans will not like it, but somebody should tell them that paying 15% taxes, they never get the social security that the Danes have. That's a discussion that's pending in Latin America. And I think it's a very relevant and important discussion. It has to do not only with the political strength to collect more taxes, because probably once we collected them, we wouldn't have very much what to do with them, because we don't have states that are strong enough to give impulse to the social programs to spend that money well. So it's a more complex situation. But it's not that, I mean, it's not that arcane, it's not that mysterious. It's something that is there, only it has never been touched. But thank you very much. You have been very kind. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary General, this has been a splendid beginning for this year's conference. You have been very generous with your time and with your thoughts and observations, and I'm sure everyone here joins me in saying muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Very interesting.